Hey guys, tonight we are stepping out of our air-conditioned comfort zones and straight into the humid, salty embrace of 15th century West Africa. You are about to trade your memory foam mattress for a world where the only thing between you and the crushing depths of the Atlantic is a very large, very hollowed out tree. It's the kind of situation where if you don't have a good sense of balance, you probably won't live past lunch. But hey, at least the view is spectacular. Before we get into the grit of sand and the spray of the sea, I want to remind you that tonight's journey is a long one, designed to let your mind drift. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me which city you are listening from and what time it is right now. Are you a night owl in New York or catching a sunrise in Tokyo? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up. The first thing you feel isn't the softness of a pillow, but the coarse, warm grit of sand against your cheek. The air is thick, like a warm, damp towel draped over your shoulders, smelling of wood smoke, fermenting palm wine, and the sharp, clean sting of salt spray. It's 1450, and you're lying on a beach along the Grain Coast, in what modern maps would call Liberia or Sierra Leone. To your left, the forest is a wall of impossible green, a tangled mystery of mahogany and silk cotton trees that seems to breathe with the rhythm of the insects. To your right, the Atlantic abyss stretches out forever. It isn't the vacation destination you know today. It is a living, breathing giant that the local mariners respect more than their own kings. You stand up, brushing the sand from your skin. Your body feels heavy in the humidity, but there's a job to do. Just above the high tide line sits the object that defines your life. A pirogue. To the uninitiated, it looks like a simple dugout canoe, but to you, it is a masterpiece of maritime engineering. This brings us to a mainstream history fact that often gets overlooked. West African maritime culture in the 15th century was incredibly robust. Long before European ships began hugging these shores, kingdoms like the Jollof Empire and the Great Benin were already master navigators of the estuaries and the open surf. They weren't just coastal huggers. They were trade titans, moving tons of salt gold and dried fish across thousands of miles of liquid highway. You walk toward the vessel, and as you run your hand along the hull, you notice something strange. The wood isn't just carved. It feels almost like polished stone. Here is a bit of obscure knowledge for you. Many of these canoes were carved from a single massive trunk of the silk cotton tree. These giants can grow up to 200 feet tall, and when a master carver finishes with one, the resulting boat can carry 80 men. But here's the weird part. The wood was often seasoned by burying the half-finished hull in river mud for months. This wasn't just some superstitious ritual. The anaerobic environment of the mud leached out the sap and replaced it with minerals, making it almost as hard as iron and resistant to the sea rot that plagued European oak ships. You look at the horizon, where the blue of the water meets the pale, hazy blue of the sky. There is a tension in the air tonight. You are part of a tradition that looks at the Atlantic not as a barrier, but as a path. This leads us to a point that keeps historians up at night. There is a significant academic debate about whether these mariners, specifically those from the Mali Empire, actually reached the Americas over a century before Columbus. The story of Musa Abubakar II, who allegedly abdicated his throne in 1311 to lead a fleet of 2,000 canoes into the Atlantic, is the stuff of legends. Some scholars point to linguistic and cultural coincidences in the Caribbean as proof, while others remain skeptical, citing a lack of physical shipwrecks. Whether they made it or not, the sheer ambition of the voyage tells you everything you need to know about the people you are standing with tonight. You grab a heavy wooden paddle. It's leaf-shaped and carved from a wood so dense it sinks in fresh water. You feel the weight of it in your palms, the calluses on your hands fitting perfectly into the grooves of the handle. You aren't just a fisherman. You are a mariner. The struggle you face today is quiet, because it isn't about grand battles or cinematic storms. It's about the constant, low-level endurance required to stay upright. It's about the silent negotiation between your muscles and the Canary Current, a powerful southbound river to sea that is currently trying to pull you away from the shore. The tide is coming in now. The waves aren't the gentle ripples of a lake. They are the surf of the Grain Coast, famous for being some of the most violent and unpredictable white water on the planet. You and your crewmates gather around the pirogue. There are 20 of you, and everyone moves with a practiced silence. You don't need to shout. The rhythm of the ocean tells you when to move. You wait for the seventh wave, the big one that clears the path, as the water rushes back out, creating a brief, smooth slide of wet sand. You dig your heels in. Now! A voice whispers, or maybe it's just the wind. You push. The mahogany hull groans as it slides over the sand. It's a physical, visceral struggle. The spray hits your face, cold and startling against the heat of the sun. For a moment, the boat is suspended between the land and the deep, and you feel that familiar flutter of fear in your chest. You aren't a master of the ocean. You are a guest in its house, and today, you've just knocked on the door. You scramble over the gunwale as the next wave lifts the bow. The transition is instant. The solid certainty of the beach is gone, replaced by the fluid, shifting reality of the Atlantic. You find your seat on a narrow wooden thwart. The pirogue dances under you, a light, responsive thing that feels every vibration of the water. You dig your paddle in. The first few strokes are the hardest, fighting the shore break that wants to turn you sideways and smash the hull into toothpicks. But then you break through the foam. The roar of the surf recedes into a dull hum, and suddenly, the world opens up. The abyss is now beneath you. It's a deep, bruised indigo color, so clear you can see the sunlight dancing in shafts hundreds of feet down. You settle into the rhythm. Asterisk dip, pull, lift, repeat. Asterisk your shoulder begin to burn, but it's a good burn, the kind that lets you know you're alive. You look back at the beach. Your village is already just a collection of tiny brown dots against the green wall of the forest. You are out here in the quiet struggle, a small human in a hollowed tree, navigating the heartbeat of the world. The journey doesn't actually begin on the water. It begins months earlier, deep in the heart of the rainforest where the canopy is so thick that the sun only reaches the ground in flickering, dusty needles of gold. You are standing in what is essentially a 15th century version of a luxury yacht factory, though it's significantly more humid and lacks an espresso machine. Before you lies a fallen mahogany giant, a titan of the forest that was likely older than your grandfather's grandfather when it was brought down. In your modern life, you might look at a tree and see shade or lumber. Here, you look at this trunk and see a spirit waiting to be given its water legs. You are holding an adze, a tool with a curved iron blade set at a right angle to the handle. It's heavy, and the handle is polished smooth by the sweat of the men who use it before you. You find your rhythm. Asterisk thwack, chip, whack, chip, asterisk the sound echoes to the clearing, a steady, hypnotic beat that competes with a high-pitched drone of cicadas. Every swing of your arm sends a shard of reddish brown flying into the moss. It's slow, grueling work, and honestly, if you were doing this for a hobby, you'd have quit 10 minutes ago and started looking for a power tool. But here, the quiet struggle is a form of meditation. You aren't just hacking at wood. You are listening to the grain. If you hit it too hard, the mahogany might split, and months of work would vanish into a very expensive pile of firewood. This brings us to a mainstream history fact that is often overlooked. West African shipbuilding was a highly specialized, hereditary craft. The master carvers were the engineers of their age, possessing a deep understanding of buoyancy, fluid dynamics, and structural integrity. They didn't just hollow out a log, they designed vessels. The hulls were carved with a specific V shape or a rounded bottom, depending on whether the boat was meant for the calm inland rivers or the brutal, pounding surf of the Atlantic. They understood that a boat meant to face the mother waves needed a thicker bow and more flexible hull than a river barge. As the sun climbs higher, the heat becomes a physical weight on your back. You stop to wipe the stinging sweat from your eyes, and that's when the precision equipment comes out. Fire. This is the obscure, slightly bizarre part of the process that always fascinates people. You don't just use iron to hollow out a 50-foot mahogany trunk. You use control burning. You lay a thin line of glowing embers along the center of the log, using damp clay to paint the areas you want to protect. The fire eats into the wood with a soft, crackling hiss, charring the interior just enough to make it softly adze to scrape away. It's a delicate dance of destruction and creation. You are using the very element that usually destroys ships to help build one. There's a certain irony in that, isn't there? You spend hours monitoring the smolder, making sure the wind doesn't catch a spark and turn your future vessel into a forest fire. The clearing is filled with the scent of toasted mahogany, a heavy, sweet, incense-like smell that clings to your hair and skin. You and the other carvers work in a synchronized line, moving down the length of the trunk like a slow-motion human saw. As the interior begins to take shape, you realize the complexity of the design. The walls aren't of uniform thickness. They are thicker at the bottom to provide a natural ballast, a low center of gravity that keeps the boat from flipping when the Atlantic decides to get moody. Now, while you're scraping away the charwood, let's talk about a point that keeps maritime historians in a state of constant, polite warfare: the Great Plank Debate. For a long time, the official version of history suggested that West Africans only knew how to make dugouts and didn't advance to plank-built ships until they saw European caravels. However, a significant group of modern scholars argues that this is a total misunderstanding of engineering efficiency. They point to the fact that a single-piece mahogany hull is actually superior to a plank ship in many ways. It's more watertight. It doesn't have seams that can rot or burst under pressure, and it's much more durable in a rocky surf. The debate isn't about primitive versus advanced. It's about whether the dugout was so perfectly suited for the African coast that there was simply no reason to build anything else. Some historians even argue that the transition to planking was a step backward in terms of local durability. By midday, your muscles are screaming. Every time you lift the adze, it feels like it's gained 5 pounds. You look at your palms, which are already starting to develop that tough, waxy yellow texture of a seasoned mariner. You take a break, sitting in the roots of a nearby tree, drinking water from a cool, porous ceramic jar. You watch the master carver. He is walking along the rim of the hull, tapping the wood with a small hammer and listening to the resonance. If the sound is too sharp, the wood is too thin. If it's too dull, there's more work to do. He is tuning the boat like a musical instrument. It's a level of sensory precision that we've almost entirely lost in our world of digital sensors and laser levels. There's an old legend in the shipyard that the mahogany tree has to be tricked into becoming a boat. You have to convince the wood that it's still alive, just in a different way. That's why, as the hull nears completion, you rub it with a mixture of palm oil and certain crushed leaves that act as a natural sealant. This mixture sinks into the pores of the wood, making it glow with a deep, dark luster that looks like polished obsidian. It makes the wood breathe in the salt water without absorbing it. Without this coating, the boat will become waterlogged and heavy, sinking deeper into the abyss with every mile. The struggle of carving is a quiet one, but it's the foundation of everything that comes later. You can be the greatest navigator in the world, but if your hull has a hidden flaw, a knot in the wood you ignored, or a section you burned too deep, the Atlantic will find it. The ocean has a way of sniffing out laziness. So, you stand back up, grip the handle of the adze, and get back to work. Asterisk thwack. Chip. Thwack. Chip. Asterisk, you are building the vessel that will carry your life, your trade, and your stories across the blue void. By the time the sun starts to set, the forest giant is no longer a tree. It has a bow, a stern, and a hollow belly. It's starting to look like something that belongs in the water. It's starting to look like a bridge between the forest and the stars. As the shadows lengthen, you cover the half-finished work with broad banana leaves to protect it from the evening dew. You walk back toward the village, your legs heavy and your mind already drifting toward the sound of the waves. You know that in a few weeks, this mahogany titan will taste salt for the first time. It will leave the stillness of the forest for the chaos of the tides. But for now, it rests in the clearing, a silent promise of the journeys to come. You close your eyes, the rhythmic sound of the adze still echoing in your ears, a heartbeat of wood and iron. The shoreline is gone. You turn your head, looking back over your shoulder, but the golden thread of the beach has been swallowed by the haze of the horizon. You are now truly in the abyss, and if you're anything like me, your first instinct is to reach for your phone to check Google Maps, only to realize it's 1450, and the only app you have is a heightened sense of panic. But you shouldn't panic. Your satellite is a turn circling overhead, and you're Touchscreen is the vibration of the water against a mahogany hull. This is a quiet struggle of 15th century navigation. The realization that the world is a book written in a language you have to learn to read with your eyes, your ears, and even your tongue. Or you'll spend the rest of eternity wandering in circles until the sharks decide you look like a late-night snack. You are a navigator of the Grain Coast, and you possess a mental map that would make a modern surveyor weep. Your first lesson in maritime literacy starts with the birds. You look up and spot a frigate bird, a dark, angular silhouette against the brilliant blue. Most people see a bird. You see a lighthouse. Here is your mainstream history fact for the night. West African mariners were masters of biological navigation. You know that the frigate bird rarely wanders more than 50 miles from land. If it's flying low and straight, it's hunting. But if it's climbing high and heading in a specific direction as the sun begins to dip, it's going home. You aren't just watching a bird. You're following a living GPS signal that knows exactly where the nearest sandbar is. But birds can be blown off course, and that's when the struggle gets truly intimate. You lean over the side of the pirogue, dipping your cupped hand into the water and bringing it to your lips. You aren't thirsty. In fact, drinking this would be a terrible idea, but you are tasting the map. This leads us to an obscure, slightly bizarre fact of the night. Expert African mariners could navigate the estuaries and the open ocean by the salinity and temperature of the water. You know that the water near the mouth of the Gambia River is sweeter, less salty than the deep brine of the mid-Atlantic. You can feel the change in temperature as you move from the shallow, sun-warmed coastal shelves into the cold, deep water currents. You are literally using your sense of taste to find the highway back to your village. It's effective, it's accurate, and it's a lot more reliable than a 15th century magnetic needle that might decide to point toward your iron adze instead of the north. As the sun begins to sink, the Atlantic turns from a sheet of polished silver into a bruised, deep indigo. You don't have a clock, but you have the stars, and they are starting to wake up. South of the Sahara, the North Star is often too low on the horizon to be useful, so you look for the stars of the sea. You find Canopus and the Southern Cross. You know that when the cross stands upright, you are heading due south toward the kingdoms of the forest. You use the stars not just as points of light, but as a grid that locks the shifting ocean into a stable geometry. It's a quiet, mental calculation that runs in the back of your mind like a background process on a computer, keeping you on course while your arms handle the physical labor of the paddle. Now, as you sit there, the pirogue rising and falling with a long, slow swell, we reach a point of academic friction that keeps maritime historians debating in their dusty archives. The coastal hugger controversy. For a long time, mainstream history assumed that ancient African mariners were too afraid to leave the sight of land, only sailing within a few miles of the shore. However, a significant group of scholars now argues that this is a total myth. They point to the sophisticated understanding of the Canary Current and the Guinea Current, suggesting that West African fleets engaged in purposeful, long-distance oceanic travel across the Great Circle of the Atlantic. The debate isn't about whether you could leave the coast, but whether you had established trade routes to islands that aren't even on the 15th century maps. Historians are still arguing over whether your ancestors were the true masters of the Atlantic gyre long before the Portuguese discovered it. You adjust your weight on the wooden thwart, feeling the pulse of the ocean. You close your eyes for a moment to listen to the hull. This is a technique often called feeling the grain. You can tell by the specific frequency of the water slapping the wood if you are moving with the current or against it. You can feel the rebound waves, the subtle ripples that bounce off a distant reef or island and travel back toward you. To you, the ocean isn't a flat surface. It's a textured landscape of hills, valleys, and invisible walls. You feel a slight shift in the wind, and it carries a faint, sweet scent of rotting mangroves and wet earth. Most people would call that a bad smell, but to you, it's the smell of a destination. You can scent the land from 20 miles out, long before your eyes can see it. The quiet struggle of navigation is the struggle against the void. It's the effort of keeping 1,000 small details in your head at once. The color of the water, the flight of a tern, the taste of the salt, and the angle of the cross. If you lose focus for even an hour, the Canary Current, that invisible, southbound river of the sea, will steal your progress and pull you into the unknown. It is a game of high-stakes chess where the board is 3,000 miles wide and made of water. You see a clump of yellow sargassum, seaweed, floating by. To a tourist, it's debris. To you, it's a compass. You look at how the weeds are bunched together. It tells you the direction of the underlying current, a hidden river within the ocean that is currently trying to push you toward the setting sun. You adjust your stroke. Asterisk dip, pull, lift, repeat. Asterisk, you aren't a victim of the ocean. You are a reader of it. You are part of a lineage that treats the Atlantic like a library, where every wave is a sentence and every star is a chapter. It's a lot of mental work for someone who just wanted to catch some fish or trade some salt, isn't it? But as the sky turns a deep velvet purple, you feel a sense of calm. You know exactly where you are. You are exactly where the bird said you would be, and the water tastes exactly like home. You take one last taste of the sea, feeling the salt linger on your tongue like a secret. The abyss doesn't feel so deep when you know its name. You look back one more time, but you don't look for the land. You look at the stars, letting them guide your mahogany cradle through the dark. You are a navigator of the 15th century, and the ocean is finally starting to tell you its secrets. You settle into the rhythm of the night. The quiet struggle, turning into a silent, steady march across the blue void. The indigo of the deep abyss starts to shift as you move closer to the shore, turning into a brilliant, translucent turquoise that looks like liquid glass. But don't let the pretty colors fool you. The quiet struggle is about to get a lot louder. You are approaching the Grain Coast, what modern travelers call Iberia, and the Ivory Coast, and the air is changing. It no longer smells of just salt and old wood. It carries a sharp, spicy kick that makes your nose tingle. This is the scent of the Malagueta pepper, the grains of paradise that gave this coastline its name. In the 15th century, these peppers were so valuable that Europeans would eventually trade weight for weight in gold just to spice up their bland medieval stews. But you aren't here for the spice. You are here to meet the masters of surf. In the distance, bobbing like corks on the massive Atlantic swells, you see a fleet of small, nimble canoes. These aren't the 80-man leviathans of the Jolliff Empire. These are the specialized surf boats of the crew people. To the rest of the world, the ocean is a dangerous mystery. But to a crew mariner, the Atlantic is basically their front yard. They are the waterborne, and joining their fleet is a bit like getting a guest pass into an elite 15th century Navy SEAL team. You watch as they move, and you realize they don't sit in their boats as much as they wear them. This brings us to our mainstream history fact of the night. The crew were so legendary for their maritime skills that for the next 400 years, every single European power, the Portuguese, the British, the Dutch, would refuse to sail this coast without hiring crewmen to navigate the treacherous bar. The bar is a massive, shifting wall of sand and white water where the deep ocean meets the shallow coast. It is a ship killer because the Grain Coast has almost no natural harbors. The crew were the essential final mile of the global economy. They were the only ones brave enough and skilled enough to ferry goods from the shore to massive ships anchored miles out in the deep. Without them, the 15th century Atlantic trade would have ground to a halt before it even started. As you pull your pirogue alongside a crew navigator, you notice he's coated in a thick, shimmering layer of palm oil. It gives the skin a dark, metallic luster under the sun. This leads us to an obscure, slightly bizarre fact that you won't find in many textbooks: the shark skin technique. The crew believed, and many still do, that rubbing the body with a specific mixture of palm oil and certain crushed herbs made them invisible or unappetizing to the sharks that patrolled the reefs. But it served a practical purpose, too. The oil acted as a 15th century wetsuit, helping the water slide off their skin and preventing the salt burn and hypothermia that comes from being soaked for 12 hours a day. It's a bit messy, and honestly, you probably smell like a very expensive salad right now. But in this surf, you'll take every advantage you can get. The sound of the ocean is changing now. The rhythmic slap-slap of the deep water is being replaced by a low, guttural roar that you can feel in your teeth. This is the bar. The waves here aren't just water. They are massive, churning walls of foam that can flip a 3-ton mahogany hull as easily as a leaf. You watch the crew mariner next to you. He isn't paddling harder. He's waiting. He's listening to the song of the breakers. He knows that the waves come in sets, and he's looking for the green window, that split second of calm between the giants. Now, while we're waiting for the right wave, let's dive into a point of academic friction that keeps anthropologists arguing in their faculty lounges: the crew identity mystery. Mainstream history often treats the crew as a distinct ethnic group that has lived on this coast since the dawn of time. However, a significant group of modern scholars argues that crew wasn't originally a tribe at all, but an occupational class. They suggest that in the 15th century, men from various interior ethnic groups who were landbound would flee to the coast and join a maritime guild. Over generations, this professional guild of sailors developed its own language, its own marks, and its own culture, eventually evolving into the ethnic group we know today. The debate is whether you are born a crew or whether you become one by surviving the bar. It's the ultimate nature versus nurture argument, played out on the crest of a 10-foot wave. You see the crew navigator stand up. He isn't sitting on a thwart anymore. He's balanced on the very edge of the gunwale, his toes gripping the wood like talons. This is a surf dance. As the mother wave approaches, he doesn't just row, he actually steps out of the canoe into the churning white water, holding onto the side with one hand, and using his legs to stabilize the boat like a human rudder. It looks suicidal, but it's the only way to keep the boat from broaching, turning sideways and being smashed. You try to mimic him, feeling the incredible, cold power of the Atlantic trying to rip your grip from the wood. It's a physical, visceral struggle, a quiet struggle, because there is no breath left for screaming. There's only the roar of the water and the fire in your muscles. And then, just as suddenly as the chaos began, it's over. The wave carries you over the sandbar, and you slide into the calm, tea-colored water of a hidden lagoon. The transition is so jarring it makes your ears pop. The roar of the Atlantic is suddenly a distant, muffled memory, blocked by the high dunes and the dense mangroves. You are drenched, exhausted, and covered in enough salt to season 1,000 yams. But you are upright. You look at your crew companion. He hasn't even broken a sweat. He just gives you a small, knowing nod, a welcome to the guild. You realize that your feet are vibrating. It's not the water. It's the sheer adrenaline of the passage. You look at your hands, which are stained a faint blue-black from the herbs and the oil. You have just survived one of the most dangerous maritime passages on the planet, using nothing but a piece of wood and your own nerves. You feel a strange sense of pride. In the 15th century, there are no medals for this, no certificates of achievement. Your reward is simply the fact that you get to do it all again tomorrow. As you paddle deeper into the lagoon, the scent of the Malagata peppers gets stronger, mixing with the earthy, damp smell of the mangrove roots. You see the village fire starting to twinkle through the trees, small orange eyes in the green darkness. You are safe, for now, but as you look back at the white line of the surf on the horizon, you know that the abyss is still there, waiting. You are a mariner of the Grain Coast now, a student of the crew, and you've just learned the most important lesson of the sea. The ocean doesn't care how strong you are. It only cares how well you can dance. The sun is a heavy, bruised orange as it sinks toward the water, and you find yourself paddling further west than any fisherman in your village would ever dare. The water beneath your mahogany hull has turned a color, so deep it's almost black, a liquid obsidian that swallows the light. You are thinking about him. Every mariner on this coast thinks about him. You are thinking about Musa al-Bukhari too, the king who decided that the gold mines of Mali weren't nearly as interesting as the edge of the world. In 1450, his name is spoken in whispers like a prayer or a warning, depending on how much you trust the ocean. This brings us to our mainstream history fact for the night. In 1324, the famous Mansa Musa arrived in Cairo on his way to Mecca, and he brought so much gold with him that he actually crashed the Egyptian economy for over a decade. But when the Sultan of Cairo asked him how he inherited such a massive empire, Musa told a story that still gives historians chills. He said that his predecessor, Abu-Bakr II, didn't believe that the Atlantic was infinite. He became obsessed with finding the limit of the Great Sea. In 1311, he didn't just send a few scouts. He abdicated his throne, handed the keys of the empire to Musa, and led an expedition of 2,000 canoes, some carrying men, others carrying gold and water, directly into the sunset. He never came back. You are currently floating in the wake of a man who gave up being the richest person on earth just to see what was over the next wave. The air out here is cooler, and the humidity of the coast has been replaced by a sharp, clean breeze that makes the salt on your skin feel like tiny needles. You look down at the floor of your pirogue. You aren't carrying 2,000 ships, but you can imagine the logistics of such a royal voyage. This leads us to an obscure, slightly bizarre detail of 1311 maritime history: the royal provisioning. To prepare for the abyss, Abu Bakari's fleet didn't just pack dried fish. According to oral traditions, they packed large ceramic jars of virgin honey and fresh water sealed with layers of beeswax to keep the salt out for up to 2 years. But the weirdest part? They supposedly carried large pots of Malian soil. The idea was that if they found a new land, they would plant the seeds of the empire in the earth of their homeland first, to claim the ground spiritually before they ever step foot on it. You can almost feel the weight of those heavy clay pots in your own boat, a strange, earthy anchor in a world of water. The quiet struggle tonight is a struggle of the mind. As the last sliver of the sun disappears, the Atlantic becomes a sea of darkness. Without the moon, you can't tell where the water ends and the sky begins. You feel like you're floating in a black marble, suspended in a void. Every splash of your paddle creates a burst of green, phosphorescent light. Tiny organisms in the water protesting your presence. It looks like you are rowing through a galaxy of underwater stars. It's beautiful, sure, but it's also terrifying. In 1450, people believe that if you sail too far west, the water starts to boil or the sun will burn your skin to ash. You know better, or at least you hope you do. You trust the stars and you trust the wood. Now, as you drift in this glowing green wake, we reach a point of academic friction that keeps historians in a state of high seas drama: the transatlantic contact debate. This is the big one. A significant group of scholars, most notably Ivan van Sertima, argued passionately that Abu Bakari's fleet didn't just wander into the void and die. They actually reached the Americas, specifically Brazil or the Caribbean, over 170 years before Columbus. They point to 14th century maps that show Antillia in the middle of the ocean, and cite reports from early Spanish explorers who claim to see black traders in the Americas. They even talk about guanin, a specific West African gold alloy found in Caribbean artifacts. However, mainstream archaeologists are still fiercely debating this, arguing that without a physical shipwreck or a DNA trail, it remains a beautiful, tragic legend. Historians argue over linguistic coincidences in the physics of the Canary Current. But for you, sitting in your 12-foot pirogue, the debate isn't about proof. It's about the fact that someone had the audacity to try. You feel a tug on the hull. It's the Canary Current, that invisible, southbound river we talked about. It wants to pull you toward the equator, toward the unknown. Abu Bakari would have felt the same pull. Did he fight it, or did he let it take him? There's an oral tradition that says one lone captain from the first, smaller expedition returned to the king. He said they found a river with a powerful current in the middle of the sea, and while the other ships were swept away into a whirlpool, he turned back. Abu Bakari's response wasn't fear, it was a promotion. He built a bigger fleet and joined them the next time. You admire that kind of stubbornness. It's the same stubbornness that keeps you paddling when your arms feel like lead and your mind starts playing tricks on you. The silence out here is absolute. It's not the empty silence of a room. It's a heavy, vibrating silence, the sound of millions of tons of water moving in secret. You feel incredibly small, a tiny speck of mahogany in a 3,000-mile graveyard of ambitions. But there's a peace in it, too. You are free from the taxes of the empire, free from the gossip of the village, and free from the laws of the land. Out here, the only law is the swell of the sea and the breath in your lungs. You realize that Abu Bakari too didn't lose his empire. He just traded a small, golden cage for a massive, blue one. As the moon finally begins to rise, casting a long, silver path across the water, you adjust your grip on the paddle. You aren't going to follow the Ghost King all the way to the sunset tonight. You have cargo of salt and gold to think about, and a village that expects you back. But you linger for just a moment, looking west. You imagine 2,000 white sails catching the moonlight, a ghost fleet of Mali moving toward a destiny that history still hasn't quite decided on. You give the abyss a small, respectful nod, a greeting from one mariner to another. You turn your pirogue back toward the east, toward the invisible line of the coast. The quiet struggle continues, the rhythmic dip-pull lift of your paddle acting as a heartbeat in the dark. You are a navigator of the 15th century, a carrier of legends and a survivor of the void. The ocean whispers to the hull, a secret language of salt and stars. And for the first time tonight, you feel like you finally understand what the Ghost King was looking for. You are leaving the royal ghosts and the deep, indigo silence of the open ocean behind, steering your mahogany pirogue into the mouth of a massive, sprawling estuary. The water here is a different beast entirely. It's no longer the clear, translucent blue of the Atlantic. It is a color of strong tea, stained dark by the tannins of millions of fallen mangrove leaves. The air is so thick with humidity, you feel like you are breathing through a warm, damp towel, and it carries a scent that is both earthy and sharp, the smell of brackish water and white gold. You have entered the maritime market, and the quiet struggle of the day has shifted from navigating the abyss to the heavy, physical labor of 15th century logistics. You're basically a 15th century delivery driver for the world's most expensive seasoning, except there's no app to tell you the customer is 10 minutes away. And if you trip, your cargo literally disappears into the water. In your hull, you are carrying slabs of salt, massive, heavy blocks carved from the salt pans of the northern desert fringes. They are stacked in the center of your canoe, and they are incredibly temperamental. This is your first quiet struggle of the afternoon, the battle against dissolution. In this humid estuary air, the salt wants to return to the sea. You can feel the surface of the blocks getting tacky, a fine layer of brine forming under your fingertips. You've covered them with broad, waxy leaves to keep the spray off. But every splash of water against the hull feels like a direct attack on your paycheck. You handle these blocks like they're made of glass, but they're much heavier, and the salt crystals have a way of finding every tiny scratch on your hands and making them sting with the fire of 1,000 suns. This brings us to our mainstream history fact for the night. The gold salt trade is usually depicted in textbooks as a desert affair with camels trekking across the Sahara. But the maritime component was just as vital. West African mariners served as the essential final mile delivery service. You would take salt from the coastal lagoons and paddle it deep into the interior via the river networks of the Senegal, the Gambia, or the Niger. In exchange, you brought back the one thing the world couldn't get enough of: gold dust. By the 15th century, West Africa was the primary source of gold for the entire Mediterranean and European world. You are essentially a courier for the global economy, moving the world's currency in a hollowed-out tree. It's high-stakes work, and honestly, the pressure of not melting your cargo is probably why your shoulders are so tense. As you navigate the narrow channel between the mangrove roots, which look like the spindly, mud-caked legs of giants, you prepare for the silent trade. This leads us to one of the most obscure and frankly bizarre practices in maritime history: the dumb barter. This wasn't a loud, shouting match at a bazaar. Often, to avoid conflict or because of language barriers, you would pull your boat up to a specific, recognized riverbank. You would unload your slabs of salt in neat rows, then return to your boat and paddle a short distance away. You would hit a gong or a drum to signal your arrival. Then the gold traders, forest people you might never actually see face to face, would emerge. They would place a pile of gold dust next to each salt slab and vanish back into the trees. You would paddle back, inspect the gold, and if the price was right, you'd take the gold and leave the salt. It was a trade built on a terrifying, silent level of trust. Imagine trying to do that with a modern online transaction, just leaving your laptop on a park bench and hoping a bag of cash appears. The struggle here is the tension of the unknown. You sit in your boat, watching the tree lean, listening to the rhythmic drip-drip of water from the mangrove branches. Is there enough gold? Is someone watching you? The silence isn't peaceful. It's a negotiation. You wait for the signal, a bird call or a distant drum. That says the counteroffer has been made. You feel the weight of the gold in your imagination before you even touch it. It's a slow-motion game of poker played with the most valuable substances on Earth. You wipe the sweat from your forehead, feeling the grit of salt and humidity. You realize that out here, silence is the most expensive language you can speak. Now, as you paddle back to shore to inspect piles, We reach that point of academic friction that keeps economic historians arguing over their morning coffee, the can-wait mystery. Standard history says that trade in this region was a bit of a free-for-all until Europeans arrived with proper scales. But a significant group of scholars who study the Akan people and the maritime networks of the Gold Coast point to a massive, incredibly sophisticated system of bronze gold weights. These weights weren't just functional. They were tiny works of art, shaped like animals, humans, or geometric symbols. Each one represented a precise, standardized unit of measurement. The debate is whether these weights were part of a unified, international maritime trade standard that existed across different kingdoms long before the 1400s. Did you have a universal currency converter in your pocket while the rest of the world was still arguing over the size of a bushel? Historians are still debating whether these weights were influenced by Islamic North Africa or were a purely local innovation. You reach the bank and step out into the mud. It's warm and squishy, pulling at your ankles as if the land itself is trying to keep you there. You walk to the first slab of salt. Next to it sits a small leather pouch. You open it, and the sunlight catches a glint of the dust inside. It's heavy, far heavier than it looks. You use a small, carved spoon made of bone to test the purity. The quiet struggle now is one of precision. You have to ensure you aren't being traded fool's gold or copper dust mixed with yellow sand. You feel the grains between your fingers, testing the drag of the metal. You spend the next hour moving back and forth between the boat and the bank, loading the gold and watching your salt vanish. It is repetitive, grueling work, and by the time you're finished, the gold dust has found its way into your hair, under your fingernails, and into the creases of your skin. You are literally shimmering in the afternoon sun, looking like some kind of minor deity, but you feel more like a very tired pack animal. The estuary is starting to wake up now. Other pirogues are appearing in the distance, some carrying dried bonga, fish that smell strong enough to wake the dead, others carrying kola nuts or fine cotton cloth. You find your balance in the canoe again, the center of gravity having shifted significantly. The boat sits lower in the water now, the weight of the gold more concentrated than the bulky salt. You have to be even more careful. A single errant wave or a hidden log could send your entire village's wealth to the bottom of the silt. You settle into familiar rhythm of the paddle, but your strokes are shorter, more controlled. As you paddle away from the silent bank, the sun begins to turn the tea-colored water into a sheet of liquid copper. You feel a sense of accomplishment, but also a lingering sense of being watched. The dumb barter is over. The trust is held, and the trade continues. You are just one link in a chain that stretches from the deep forests of the interior to the royal courts of Timbuktu and beyond. You realize that your quiet struggle, the salt on your skin, the gold in your hull, and the silence of the mangroves, is what keeps the world turning. You take a deep breath of the humid air, letting the rhythmic splash of your paddle act as a lullaby for the evening. The market is closed, the trade is done, and the abyss is calling you back to the deep. The golden glow of successful trade is still warming your spirit. But as you steer your mahogany pirogue back toward the open Atlantic, the horizon decides to present you with a riddle that isn't in any of your navigation songs. You are drifting in the late afternoon heat, the swells feeling like the slow, heavy breathing of a sleeping giant. The air is still, but the water beneath your hull is restless. You scan the distance, expecting the familiar silhouette of a crewed fleet or the reliable path of a frigate bird. Instead, you see a speck. It's a white, flickering ghost on the edge of the world, appearing right with a bruised indigo of the sea meets the pale haze of the sky. At first, you think it's a hallucination, one of those barren land stares where your mind tries to turn a cloud into a village. But this ghost doesn't vanish when you blink. It grows. It multiplies. Now there are two, then three. They have wings, but they aren't birds. They're what the elders will soon call floating castles. And they are about to change a quiet struggle into a very loud era of history. As they draw closer, you realize that these things are massive, awkward, and frankly, a bit over-engineered. They are Portuguese caravels. Here is your mainstream history fact for the night. By the mid-1440s, under the obsessive direction of Prince Henry the Navigator, Portuguese explorers had finally pushed past Cape Bojador, a place once feared as a point of no return where the water allegedly boiled. They arrived in your waters with revolutionary design. The caravel, unlike your pirogue, which is a masterclass in organic, single-unit construction, these ships are complex puzzles of oak, pine, and iron nails. They're designed to do something your canoe does naturally: sail against the wind. You watch them tack, zigzagging across the swells like a confused crab. It looks inefficient compared to the sleek, straight-line speed of your mahogany dugout, but there's an undeniable, heavy power in the way they displace the Atlantic. They don't glide over the abyss. They push it aside with an arrogant, wooden thud. You stop paddling and let the current take you, squinting at these strange apparitions. This leads us to an obscure, slightly bizarre fact about these first encounters: the living ship theory. Early Portuguese chronicles, such as those by Alvais Cadamosto, recorded that when West African mariners first saw these ships, many believed they were giant, supernatural birds, or even living spirits of the sea. Because the sails were white and the hulls were often painted with light-colored lime or lead-based mixtures to prevent rot, they looked like biological entities. There are oral traditions suggesting that some villagers actually paddled out and tried to feed the ships by throwing fish at the wooden hulls, wondering if the great white birds were hungry after such a long flight from the horizon. You watch the caravels bobbing in the distance, and honestly, you can see why. They don't look like they were built. They look like they were hatched. The ships drop anchor with a thunderous splash that sends ripples all the way to your pirogue. You see men on the deck, pale, salt-crusted figures wrapped in heavy, impractical fabrics. You wonder how they survive the humidity in those wool tunics without melting into a puddle. You smell them before you hear them. A scent of stale beer, old cheese, and unwashed wool that cuts through the clean salt spray like a knife. This is the first quiet struggle of cultural contact, the sensory shock of meeting people who live in a completely different relationship with the water. To you, the ocean is a bath, a highway, and a god. To them, it's a terrifying barrier they spent months trying to survive inside a wooden box. Now, as you sit there watching the floating castle sway, we reach that point of academic friction that keeps maritime historians debating in their faculty lounges: the parity of power dispute. For a long time, mainstream history portrayed this moment as the immediate technological domination of Africa by Europe. But a significant group of modern scholars argues that in the 15th century, the tactical advantage actually belonged to you. While the caravels had cannons and high decks, they were essentially useless in the shallow estuaries and treacherous surf where the real wealth was located. Historians argue that West African naval forces, with their fleets of highly maneuverable canoes and expert knowledge of the bar, were more than a match for clumsy European ships. In fact, many of the first encounters were negotiated pieces, simply because the Portuguese realized that if they tried to land without your permission, they'd be swamped and neutralized before their boots ever touched the sand. You aren't looking at a conqueror. You're looking at a very large, very confused guest who doesn't know what the sandbars are. You reach for a cola nut in your pouch, cracking it between your teeth. The bitter, caffeinated juice wakes up your senses, grounding you in the reality of the moment. You watch the Portuguese lower a small wooden boat, a longboat. It moves slowly, the oars hitting the water with a clunky, uneven rhythm that makes you want to laugh. They have no water legs. You realize that while they have the wings to cross the ocean, you possess the map to survive the coast. It's a strange, tense standoff. You represent a lineage that has read these waters for 1,000 years. They represent a world that just learned how to build a better rudder. The struggle in this moment is the struggle of curiosity. You want to go closer, to see if their bird wings are made of palm mat or something else, but the caution of a mariner keeps you at a distance. You know the Atlantic doesn't like crowds. You watch the way the sun hits the white canvas of their sails, turning them into glowing sheets of gold. It's beautiful in a terrifying sort of way. You know that the trade for salt and gold is about to become much more complicated. The quiet struggle is about to involve new languages, new gods, and new types of iron. But for this one afternoon in 1450, there's only the silence of the swell and the sight of two different versions of humanity staring at each other across 100 yards of blue water. You pick up your paddle again. You don't head toward them. Not yet. You have a cargo of gold to protect and a tide to catch. You dig the leaf-shaped blade into the water, feeling the familiar, solid resistance of the Atlantic. You move away with a sleek, silent efficiency that the floating castles could never hope to achieve. You leave them there, bobbing in the distance, a white speck in a blue void, while you disappear in the shadows of the mangrove coast. You are a navigator, a master of the abyss, and you've just seen the future. It looks a bit heavy. It smells like old wool, and it's going to need a lot of help finding the way home. The sky is turning a deep, dusty purple now, and the stars are starting to poke through the haze. You settle back into your rhythm. Asterisk, dip, pull, lift, repeat. Asterisk, the arrival of the wings hasn't changed the heartbeat of the ocean, and it hasn't changed the strength in your shoulders. You are a 15th century mariner, and the quiet struggle continues, one wave at a time. You close your eyes for a second, letting the sound of the caravel's creaking timber fade into the steady, rhythmic splash of your own paddle. The ocean is vast enough for everyone, but only those who know its taste get to keep its secrets. The white wings of the Portuguese caravels are finally swallowed by the haze of the horizon, leaving you alone once more with the rhythmic swaying of the Atlantic. But as you navigate your mahogany pirogue back toward the labyrinth of the mangrove swamps, the quiet struggle takes on a sharper, more internal edge. Your body is starting to feel like it's being slowly dismantled by an invisible thief. Your gums are tender, bleeding slightly when you chew on a piece of dried fish, and your joints have a dull, persistent ache that makes every stroke of the paddle feel like you're pulling through wet cement instead of water. In your modern life, you probably just think you need a better mattress or maybe a vacation. Here in 1450, you might fear you've been cursed by a rival navigator, but you know better. You are running low on sunshine in a bottle, and the struggle of the morning is a desperate search for the hidden pharmacy of the mangroves. You steer your pirogue deep into the brackish shadows where the water is still and the mosquitoes are the size of small birds. You are looking for a specific green, a bright, waxy lime green that stands out against the dark, muddy bronze of the mangrove roots. You find a cluster of wild citrus trees, their branches heavy with small, bitter lemons. You reach out and pick one, the skin oily and fragrant under your thumb. You don't just eat it. You treat it like a holy relic. This brings us to our mainstream history fact for the night. While textbooks often credit the 18th century British Royal Navy and DR, James Lind with discovering that citrus prevents scurvy, maritime cultures across Africa and Asia have been using local fruits and herbs for this exact purpose for centuries. By the 15th century, West African mariners on long-distance voyages had a deep, practical understanding of mariner's medicine. They didn't know about vitamin C as a molecule, but they knew that if you didn't have fresh fruit or certain green leaves on a long haul, your body would eventually give up on you. You aren't just a sailor. You are a practitioner of a survival science that the rest of the world wouldn't write down for another 300 years. You sit in the shade of a massive baobab tree near the water's edge, squeezing the lemon juice into a small wooden bowl. You mix it with a bit of honey and a bitter infusion made from the bark of a specific mangrove species. It tastes terrible, a sharp, acidic punch that makes your toes curl, but you feel an almost instant awakening in your senses. This leads us to an obscure, slightly bizarre fact of the night: the preserved sun technique. African mariners didn't just carry fresh fruit, which rots in the humidity. They often preserved the juice in ceramic jars, sealed with a thick layer of palm oil on top to keep the air out. Some even soaked their dried meat in citrus brine before the journey. It was a primitive form of canned health. There is even evidence of sailors using a specific type of hibiscus tea, rich in antioxidants, as a daily ocean tonic. You are essentially drinking a 15th century version of an energy drink, but without the neon colors and the heart palpitations. As you lean back against the cool, rough bark of the tree, listening to the rhythmic thrum of the forest, we reach that point of academic friction that keeps ethnobotanists and historians arguing in their faculty lounges: the intentionality debate. Standard history often portrays pre-colonial medicinal successes as accidental, that sailors just happened to like lemons as a seasoning and therefore didn't get sick by pure luck. However, a significant group of modern scholars argues that the evidence points to a deliberate, systematic medical tradition. They point to the specialized roles of healer mariners within the fleets and the consistent presence of specific medicinal plants in ancient coastal settlements. Did your ancestors have a theory of deficiency long before the microscope? Or was it just a series of very lucky culinary choices? The debate is as deep as the silt in the riverbed. But as the ache in your joints begins to fade slightly, you're inclined to give the healers the credit they deserve. The struggle here is the quiet, invisible battle for internal health. At sea, your greatest enemy isn't always the shark or the storm. It's the lack of variety. You spend the next hour gathering more lemons and a few handfuls of sea purslane, a salty, succulent green that grows along the tide line. You are restocking the pharmacy, feeling a sense of relief as you load the ceramic jars back into mahogany hull. You realize that the quiet struggle isn't just about the strength in your arms. It's about the knowledge in your head. You have to know which root heals a fever and which leaf stops a wound from festering in the salt air. It's a lot to carry, the gold, the salt, and the knowledge of life and death. But the pirogue is stable, and the tide is starting to turn. The sun is directly overhead now, turning the swamp into a steaming greenhouse. You decide to linger in the shadows for a while longer, watching a mudskipper hop across the exposed roots. It's a tiny, prehistoric-looking creature that seems as comfortable on land as it is in the water. You feel a bit like that yourself, a creature of two worlds, the solid forest and the fluid abyss. You take another sip of your bitter tonic, feeling the acidity cleanse your system. It's a strange, quiet victory, finding health in a place that looks like it's designed to rot. You look at your hands again. The cuts from the salt slabs are still there, but they don't look as angry and red as they did this morning. The medicine is working. You have just outsmarted a biological ghost. As the afternoon breeze begins to rattle the palm fronds, providing a much-needed cooling effect, you prepare to head back out to the main channel. The quiet struggle continues, but your joints are a little looser and your mind is a little sharper. You dig the paddle into the tea-colored water, the movement feeling more fluid now. You aren't just moving through the water. You are moving through a world where everything, every leaf, every fruit, every drop of brine, has a purpose. You just have to be quiet enough to hear what it's trying to tell you. You are a navigator of the 15th century Atlantic, and you've just realized that your boat isn't the only thing that needs maintenance. The forest begins to recede as you paddle toward the mouth of the river. The abyss is waiting for you again, but this time you are bringing a bit of the forest with you. You settle into the rhythm of the paddle. The quiet struggle, turning into a steady, healthy march toward the next horizon. You look at the ceramic jars tucked under the waxy leaves and feel a strange sense of companionship with them. They are your silent guardians, your sunshine for the dark nights ahead. You close your eyes for a second, letting the humidity of the swamp fade into the clean, sharp sting of the ocean air. You are ready for whatever the Atlantic has to say next. The bitter taste of the lemon and mangrove tonic is still lingering on your tongue, a sharp reminder of the internal battle for health. But as you navigate your mahogany pirogue back toward the wide, shimmering mouth of the Gambia River, the quiet struggle takes on a much more tactical, external dimension. You aren't just looking for fruit anymore. You are part of a floating wall. The air is heavy, even by West African standards, and the land breeze has died down, leaving the river's surface as flat and reflective as a polished obsidian mirror. But the silence is deceptive. Hidden among the stilt roots of the mangroves, dozens of other pirogues are sitting perfectly still, their dark hulls blending into the deep shadows of the overhanging branches. You are part of a riverine blockade, and today, the Atlantic Abyss has sent its winged representatives back for a second look. But this time, they aren't here to trade. You check the quiver resting against your hip. Inside are arrows with tips carved from bone or iron, but it's the sticky, dark resin coating the points that matters most. This brings us to an obscure, slightly bizarre fact of 15th century maritime warfare: the 10-minute death. African mariners, particularly those in the Senegambia region, were masters of botanical chemistry. They used a poison derived from the strophanthus plant, a potent cardiac glycoside. A single scratch from one of these arrows wouldn't cause a massive, cinematic explosion of blood. Instead, it would quietly and efficiently stop the heart of a grown man within 10 to 15 minutes. You don't need a heavy cannon that takes 5 minutes to reload and usually misses. You have a silent, organic missile system that the Portuguese, in their heavy, clanking armor, are absolutely terrified of. To them, it looks like dark magic. To you, it's just very effective forestry. Here is your mainstream history fact to anchor the narrative. In 1455 and 1456, the famous Venetian explorer Alvise Cadamosto, sailing under the Portuguese flag, attempted to explore the Gambia River. He didn't find a warm welcome. His chronicles record that his caravels were met by a fleet of canoes, some carrying up to 150 men, that refused to let him pass. These weren't primitive tribesmen. They were a coordinated naval force defending their sovereign waters. Cadamosto's journals describe the intense fear his sailors felt when they saw the African mariners standing up in their canoes, arrows notched, refusing to be intimidated by the caravel's high decks or stone-throwing bombards. You are one of those mariners, standing in the same V-shaped hull we talked about earlier, realizing that while the Europeans have the wings to cross the ocean, you have the teeth to hold the river. You watch the Portuguese caravel as it tries to navigate the treacherous, shifting sandbars of the river mouth. It looks like a giant, clumsy swan trying to walk through a thorn bush. The sailors on deck are wearing breastplates and helmets that catch the sun, and you can't help but feel a bit of late-night snark toward them. In this 100% humidity, those men must be like slow-cooked lobsters inside tin cans. Every time the caravel hits a shallow patch, you hear the groan of timber and the frantic shouting of the crew. They are completely out of their element. Your pirogue, on the other hand, draws only a few inches of water. You can skim over the mud flats that would tear the bottom out of their oak-planked hulls. This is the ultimate asymmetric warfare. Now, as the caravel inches closer, we reach a point of academic friction that keeps military historians arguing into the early hours. The monopoly versus hostility debate. Standard history often portrays these early skirmishes as simple clashes of civilizations or native hostility towards strangers. However, a significant group of modern scholars argues that these naval blocks were actually a very calculated, sophisticated economic defense. The mariners of the Gambia and the Senegal rivers weren't just fighting intruders. They were protecting their monopoly on the gold and salt trade. They knew that if the Europeans got upstream, the local middleman profit would vanish. The debate is whether you were a warrior defending your home or a maritime customs officer enforcing a very strict trade policy with the help of a poison-tipped arrow. Was it a war, or was it just a very intense business negotiation? Historians argue over the nuances of 15th century diplomacy, but as you feel the tension in your bowstring, it feels like both. The struggle is quiet because you aren't shouting. You are waiting. The caravel finally lowers a longboat filled with armed men. They think their crossbows and heavy shields will protect them. You wait until they are within 50 yards. The Strophanthus zone. You give a low, bird-like whistle, a signal that ripples through the mangroves. Suddenly, the shadows come alive. Dozens of pirogues launch from roots, their paddles hitting the water in a rhythmic, aggressive splash. You don't aim for the armor. You aim for the gaps, the necks, the arms, the thighs. You let the first arrow fly. It's a soft thrum, almost lost in the sound of the river. You watch the panic set in on the longboat. The Portuguese try to fire their crossbows, but they are unstable on the shifting water. One of their stone-shot bombards goes off with a massive boom, sending a plume of water into the air 50 feet away from you. It's loud and scary, sure, but it's completely ineffective against a dozen moving targets. They are trying to hit mosquitoes with a hammer. You, meanwhile, are already notching your second arrow. You aren't trying to sink the ship. You are just making it very clear that the River of Gold is closed to the season. You see a Portuguese sailor pull a small bone-tipped arrow from his shoulder, looking confused. He doesn't know that the quiet struggle has already entered his bloodstream. Within minutes, the longboat begins to retreat, the oarsmen rowing with frantic, disorganized energy. The floating castle begins to weigh anchor. The Portuguese have decided that the grains of paradise aren't worth the 10-minute death. You watch them turn back toward the open Atlantic, their white sails shrinking against the bruised indigo of the abyss. You don't chase them. You don't need to. The river has held. You feel a wave of relief wash over you, but you don't celebrate with a shout. You simply lower your bow and settle back onto the wooden thwart. The quiet struggle of the morning is over, but you know they'll be back. They always come back when there's gold involved. The sun is starting to set now. painting the water in shades of bruised apricot and dusty violet. You and the other mariners begin to emerge from the mangroves, the fleet moving together like a single dark organism. There's a strange sense of companionship in the silence. You look at your mahogany hull, the same one you carved in the forest and seasoned in the mud, and you feel a deep physical connection to it. It protected you today, just as you protected the river. You are a navigator, a trader, and now a defender of the coast. You realize that the abyss isn't just out there in the deep water. It's right here, in the choices you make to protect your world. As the first few stars begin to blink through the humid haze, you settle into a slower rhythm. The adrenaline is fading, replaced by that familiar, heavy fatigue of the mariner. You look toward the horizon one last time. The wings are gone, and the Atlantic is just a vast, breathing void once more. You are a 15th century mariner, and you have survived another day of the quiet struggle. You close your eyes for a second, letting the sound of the receding tide act as a lullaby. You are safe. The river is yours, and the secrets of Strophanthus remain hidden in the green shadows of the bank. The adrenaline from the riverine ambush is finally starting to cool, leaving behind a hollow, gnawing ache in the pit of your stomach that even the most beautiful sunset over the Gambia can't satisfy. The floating castles have retreated to horizon, and for now, the only battle you're facing is the one between your hunger and your exhaustion. You are sitting in the center of your mahogany pirogue, the wood still warm from the afternoon sun, watching the first few stars struggle to pierce through the indigo haze. It's time for dinner. But in 1450, there's no such thing as a quick meal. The quiet struggle of the evening is a slow, deliberate process of fueling a body that has spent the day fighting currents, tides, and intruders. You're essentially trying to host a dinner party on a moving balance beam, but without the luxury of a dining table or menu. You reach into the shadows of the bow and pull out a large, heavy ceramic pot. This isn't just any pot, it's your kitchen, because you're in a wooden boat filled with gold and flammable mats. You can't exactly build a roaring bonfire. Instead, you have a fire pot, a thick-walled clay vessel lined with a deep layer of sand and several flat river stones. You carefully arrange a few precious chunks of charcoal on top of the stones. This is the obscure, slightly bizarre fact of the night: the canoe hearth. West African mariners were absolute masters of portable heat. They developed these specialized fire pots that allowed them to simmer food for hours without the heat ever reaching the mahogany hull. You blow gently on the embers, watching them glow a soft, pulsing orange, a tiny sun captured in a clay jar. If you were a Portuguese sailor right now, you'd be chewing on a piece of hardtack that's basically a flavored rock. But you're about to have a hot meal. Here is your mainstream history fact for your evening meal. The backbone of your diet and the secret to your endurance is Pennisetum glaucum, pearl millet. While the rest of the 15th century world was often struggling with temperamental wheat or rice, West African civilizations had perfected the cultivation of millet and sorghum. These are super grains. Millet is drought-resistant, packed with protein, and has a shelf life that would make a modern prepper jealous. It is the fuel of empires. You pour a measured amount of millet flour into a smaller pot of water, stirring it with a wooden paddle until it begins to thicken into a dense, nourishing porridge. The scent is nutty and toasted, a comforting contrast to the sharp, metallic smell of the river mud. As the steam begins to rise, carrying the nutty scent of the grain, you reach for a small bundle wrapped in oil-soaked leaves. Inside is a piece of smoked bonga fish. It's dark, salty, and has been cured over a slow mangrove fire until it's as tough as leather. You tear off a strip and drop it into the pot. This leads us to another obscure maritime detail: the smoke cure monopoly. Because salt was often too valuable to use purely for preservation, mariners relied on cold smoking techniques. The smoke from a red mangrove didn't just preserve the fish, it infused it with a chemical barrier that repelled the humid Atlantic rot. You are essentially eating a piece of pre-modern technology designed to survive the tropics. It's salty, smoky, and honestly, after a day of paddling, it tastes better than any 5-star meal you've ever had in your modern life. The porridge is bubbling now, a slow, thick glup-glup sound that is incredibly satisfying in the silence of the river. You add a pinch of crushed Malagueta pepper. The heat of the spice hits the back of your throat, causing a localized explosion of warmth that helps you forget the damp chill of the evening mist. You balance the wooden bowl on your knees, feeling the weight of it. This is the real struggle, the physical act of eating on a moving target. Every time a distant swell rolls on the hull, the pirogue tips, and you have to adjust your entire core to keep your dinner from becoming a gift to the catfish. It's a full-body workout just to get a spoonful of porridge into your mouth. You realize that your six-pack isn't from the gym, it's from trying not to spill your soup. Now, as you sit there, lit by the faint orange glow of your fire pot, we reach that point of academic friction that keeps nutritional historians debating into the early hours, the caloric surplus debate. For decades, mainstream history assumed that pre-colonial sailors were constantly on the verge of starvation, limited by how much food they could carry. However, a significant group of modern researchers is increasingly pointing to the fermentation factor. They argue that by carrying fermented millet dough and probiotic-rich dolo millet beer, West African fleets maintain a much higher caloric and nutritional density than previously thought. The debate is whether your diet actually gave you a biological advantage over the European sailors, whose diet of dry biscuits and salted beef often left them physically depleted and prone to illness. Did you have gut health optimized for the Atlantic while the rest of the world was just trying to survive? The historians argue over grain yield data, but as the warmth of the millet spreads through your chest, you feel like the winner of that argument. You use your fingers to scoop the last of the porridge from bowl. It's a tactile, intimate way to eat. You can feel the texture of the grain and the flaky remnants of the fish. You look out over the water. The river is a sheet of black glass now, reflecting the stars so perfectly that it feels like you're floating in the middle of the cosmos. You feel a deep, heavy sense of peace. The battle is over. The trade is done and your belly is full. In the 15th century, that's a very successful day. You rinse the bowl in the river, the cool water feeling good against your calloused hands. There's a final, obscure custom you perform before putting the fire out. You take a single grain of millet and drop it into the water. A small thank you to the spirits of the river for not flipping you over today. It's a tiny gesture, almost invisible in the dark, but it's part of the etiquette of the abyss. You cover the fire pot with a heavy lid, extinguishing the glow. The world goes black for a moment until your eyes adjust to moonlight. The smell of the charcoal lingers in the air, a smoky perfume that blends with the scent of the night-blooming lilies on the bank. The quiet struggle of the meal is finished. Your muscles feel a little less tight, and the ache in your joints has retreated to a dull hum. You are a navigator, a trader, and now a satisfied diner of the 15th century Atlantic. You settle back against the curve of the mahogany, pulled into the rhythmic swaying of the tide. The river is whispering to the boat, a secret language of currents and silt. And for the first time today, you don't have to listen for danger. You just have to listen to the breath of the world. You close your eyes, the taste of pepper and smoke still on your tongue, and let the darkness carry you. The taste of the millet porridge is still a warm memory in the back of your throat. But as the first light of dawn begins to turn the eastern horizon into a bruised shade of peach and gold, the quiet struggle takes on a terrifyingly fluid dimension. You have left the shelter of the Gambia's mouth, leaving behind protective embrace of the mangroves. Behind you, the trees are a dark, jagged line on the water. Before you, the Atlantic has stopped being a playground and has become a one-way street. You feel in the mahogany hull before you see it in the waves, a steady, relentless pull that makes the pirogue feel like it's being towed by a giant hand. You have entered the river of the sea, the Canary Current, and as you dig your paddle into the deep indigo water, you realize that out here, the ocean isn't just something you sail on. It's something that is trying to decide exactly where you belong, whether you like it or not. You find yourself squinting at the water, looking for the seams in the abyss. To an amateur, the ocean is just a flat expanse of blue, but to a 15th century navigator, it's a topographical map of moving hills and invisible valleys. The Canary Current is a massive cold water conveyor belt that sweeps south along the coast of West Africa. It's powerful, it's cold. In the era of sail and paddle, it's the ultimate gatekeeper. You feel the mahogany vibrate under your feet as the current catches the hull. If you stop paddling, you aren't just sitting still. You are drifting toward the equator at a rate of 20 or 30 miles a day. It's a quiet, invisible theft of progress. Every second you spend resting is a second the ocean spends moving you away from your home. It's the ultimate 15th century treadmill, except you can't hit the stop button and the gym is full of salt water. Here is your mainstream history fact for this leg of the journey. For centuries, the Canary Current combined with the prevailing trade winds created what Europeans call the point of no return at Cape Ojader. Because the current was so strong and the winds blew so consistently from the north, European sailors believed that if they passed this point, they would never be able to sail back against the river of the sea. It was considered a literal edge of the world, a place where the ocean turned into a downward slope you could never climb again. But for you, and for the mariners of the Joliffe and Mali empires, this current wasn't a wall. It was a highway. You knew its rhythms long before the first Portuguese caravel was a glimmer in Prince Henry's eye. You understood that to survive this current, you didn't fight it head-on. You danced with it. You adjust the leaf-shaped blade of your paddle, feeling the tension in your shoulders. The struggle is quiet because it's a battle of endurance, not a sprint. You have to keep a specific angle against the swell to avoid being pushed too far out into the deep Atlantic, where the abyss truly lives. This leads us to an obscure, slightly bizarre fact of the night: the sargassum compass. Expert West African mariners often use the alignment of floating sargassum seaweed to judge the speed and direction of the underlying current. You look for the long, golden brown lanes of weed. If they are bunched together and moving in a straight line, the current is fast and deep. If they are scattered and swirling, you are in an eddy, a place of temporary safety where you can catch your breath. You are literally reading the ocean's hair to find your way home. It's a bit like trying to navigate a city by looking at how the trash blows down the street. Except the trash is gold-colored seaweed and the street is 3 miles deep. The water is colder here, a sharp contrast to the humid, tropical air of the river. You feel the spray on your chest, and it makes you shiver. This is the abyss being honest with you. It doesn't care about your gold, your salt, or how many subscribers you have. It only cares about the physics of the drift. You lean forward, putting your weight into each stroke. Asterisk dip, pull, lift. Asterisk rhythm is your only defense against the silence of the current. You look at the Southern Cross, watching it tilt slowly as the hours pass. You are measuring your life by the degrees of the stars and the resistance of the water. You realize that your quiet struggle is actually a giant planetary mechanism moving beneath your feet. Now, as the sun reaches its zenith, turning the Atlantic into a sheet of white-hot metal that seems to sizzle against the hull, we reach that point of academic friction that keeps maritime historians in a state of high-seas drama: the Volta do Mar debate. Standard history claims that the Portuguese invented the Volta do Mar, the technique of sailing far out into the Atlantic to find the westerlies that would carry a ship back north, bypassing the Canary Current. However, a significant group of scholars and experimental archaeologists argue that West African mariners had mastered their own version of this loop long before. They point to the oral traditions of great return voyages and a specific design of ocean-going canoes that seem built for deep-sea swells. The debate is whether you, in your mahogany dugout, possess the secret of the Great Loop. Knowing that to go home, you first had to sail toward the sunset. Did you understand the geometry of the ocean's heart before the rest of the world? Historians argue over current charts and wind patterns, but as you feel the powerful tug of the Atlantic, the debate feels less like a theory and more like a survival manual. The struggle is relentless. Your palms are starting to sting from the salt and the friction, the waxy yellow calluses finally giving way to raw, red skin. You don't stop. You can't. You look at the horizon, searching for the green flash of land or the white speck of a distant sail. The ocean feels wider than it did this morning. It's an optical illusion created by the current, the way it stretches the world, making every mile feel like 10. You feel a strange sense of insignificance. You are a 6-foot man in a 12-foot tree on a 3,000-mile river of salt. It's a humbling thought, but you don't have time for a midlife crisis. You have a current to manage, but then you see it, a small, dark shape bobbing in the distance. It's not a boat, it's a sea turtle. It's moving with the current, its flippers barely moving as it hitches a ride on the canary's back. You watch it for a moment, and you realize the turtle has the right idea. The quiet struggle isn't about brute force, it's about efficiency. You adjust your stroke, letting the current carry part of the load. You aren't fighting the ocean, you are using it. You find a sweet spot in the swell, a place where the water seems to push you forward even as it tries to pull you south. You've stopped wrestling the giant and started leaning on him. As the sun begins its long, lazy descent, painting the sky in shades of bruised apricot and dusty violet, you feel a deep, hollow exhaustion. But the abyss has been kind today. You have maintained your position. You haven't been swept away into the darkness. You look back toward where the coast should be, and though you can't see it, you can smell the mangroves again, a faint, muddy, earthy scent on the evening breeze. You have survived the pull of the river. You have stood your ground on a moving floor. You settle into a slower rhythm, the mahogany hull whispering a secret to the deep water. The stars are starting to wake up, and the canary current is still there, a silent, powerful presence beneath you. You are a navigator of the 15th century Atlantic, and you have danced with the giant. You close your eyes for a second, feeling the rhythmic swaying of the river, the sea. And for the first time today, you aren't afraid of the drift. You are just a part of it. You are the current, and the current is you. The river, the sea, is still pulsing beneath your mahogany hull, but as the sun climbs into the hazy, humid sky of another day, the isolation of the abyss begins to be replaced by the intense, almost claustrophobic social pressure of the crew. You aren't just a lone man in a dugout anymore. You are a single cog in a massive, floating machine. To your left and right, other pirogues are spaced exactly 20 yards apart, their paddles rising and falling in synchronization, so perfect it looks like the heartbeat of a single organism. You realize that the quiet struggle isn't just about fighting the Atlantic or the currents. It's about the exhausting, invisible etiquette of the crew. In 1450, a ship isn't a democracy. It's a floating hierarchy where everyone has a specific place. And if you forget yours, the ocean is the only place left to go. It's the ultimate form of micromanagement, where your office is 12 feet long and everyone knows exactly how loud you snore. You shift your weight on the wooden thwart, careful not to let your shoulder touch the man behind you. Out here, space is more valuable than gold dust. You are part of a 20-man crew, and the social abyss inside the boat is just as deep as the one beneath the hull. At the very stern sits the master oarsman. He doesn't paddle like the rest of you. He sits on a slightly elevated seat carved directly into mahogany, his hands resting on a massive steering sweep. He is the priest of the currents, the man who speaks to the stars, and his silence is the most powerful thing in the boat. You don't look him in the eye, and you certainly don't speak to him unless he speaks to you first. You just listen for the rhythmic tapping of his wooden staff against the side of the hull, the steady heartbeat that dictates the speed of your life. Here is your mainstream history fact for this afternoon. The social structure of West African maritime groups, particularly the crew and the Jolliffe, was incredibly rigorous and highly specialized. Every man on this boat has a title and a specific set of responsibilities. There is a master of the bow, who watches for reefs in the green flash of land, the master of the ropes, who handles the heavy palm mat sails, and the master of the hearth, who guards the fire pot. This wasn't just a group of random fishermen. It was a professional naval class with a rank structure as complex as any European royal court. The crew, in particular, were so famous for their maritime discipline that for centuries, they would be sought after by every major empire as the most reliable pilots in the Atlantic. You are part of a professional guild where your job description is literally written in the way you hold your paddle. You feel the sweat stinging your eyes, but you don't stop paddling to wipe it. That would break the rhythm. And breaking the rhythm is the quickest way to get a very stern lecture from the master of the bow. This leads us to an obscure, slightly bizarre fact of the night: the gourd etiquette. On a long-distance voyage, fresh water is kept in large, communal calabashes. You don't just grab a drink whenever you're thirsty. That's a rookie move. There's a strict ritual. The youngest apprentice, usually the baler, brings a gourd to each man in order of seniority. You take exactly 3 swallows, and you must pour a single drop onto the mahogany floor before the gourd is taken away. To drink more is a social crime. To spill a drop on your neighbor is practically a declaration of war. You are constantly managing your physical thirst against the rigid social expectations of the group. The quiet struggle of this chapter is the physical toll of being at the bottom of the ladder. You look down at the floor of the pirogue. Because these mahogany hulls aren't 100% watertight, and because the spray is constant, there's always an inch or two of brine sloshing around your ankles. At the bottom of the social hierarchy are the apprentices, whose only job for 12 hours a day is to scoop that water out with a half calabash. It is back-breaking, repetitive work. Asterisk scoop. Lift. Pull. Repeat. Asterisk if the water reaches 3 inches. The master oarsman will give a specific, low-frequency hum. That means the bailers are failing. It's a sound of pure, unadulterated disappointment that makes every man in the boat work a little harder. You remember being a bailer. It's the reason your lower back still twinges every time the wind changes. Now, as the sun beats down on your shoulders, turning the salt on your skin into a stinging white crust, we reach that point of academic friction that keeps maritime sociologists arguing in their faculty lounges. The canoe as a microstate debate. Standard history often assumes these crews were just family groups or simple tribal units. However, a significant group of scholars argues that 15th century West African fleets were actually mobile meritocracies. They point to evidence that men from different ethnic groups and social classes could earn high-ranking maritime titles through skill and bravery, rather than just birthright. The debate is whether the pirogue was a place where traditional land-based hierarchies were suspended in favor of a new, aquatic social order. Was your boat a floating village, or was it the world's first meritocratic corporation? Historians argue over the titles of the sea found in oral traditions, but as you watch the apprentice bailer work with frantic, determined energy, the hierarchy feels very real and very permanent. You watch the master oarsman at the stern. He hasn't moved for hours, staring at a point on the horizon that you can't even see yet. There's another obscure fact here that dictates your posture: the shadow taboo. It is strictly forbidden for any crew member's shadow to fall across the master oarsman while he is navigating. To cross his line of sight or to block his connection to the horizon is believed to blind the boat. You spend your day twisting and leaning, not just a paddle, but to ensure your shadow stays firmly on your own side of the hull. It's a quiet, exhausting dance of posture, ensuring that you remain physically productive without ever becoming spiritually intrusive. The struggle is about the total suppression of the self for the survival of the whole. You are tired, your back is screaming, and honestly, you're bored of the millet and the smoked fish. But you look at the men around you. Their shoulders are moving in the exact same arc. Their breath is hitting the water in the same rhythm. There's a strange, hypnotic comfort in this collective struggle. You aren't an individual anymore. You are a part of a 20-man mahogany engine. The Atlantic abyss feels a little less terrifying when you realize you are surrounded by 19 other people who are just as committed to not sinking as you are. As the afternoon begins to fade into a dusty, golden haze, the master oarsman finally taps his staff against the hull twice. The rhythm slows. The paddles hit the water with a gentler, more relaxed splash. It's a signal for the evening shift change. You feel a wave of relief wash over you, but you don't celebrate. You simply pass your paddle to the man who is resting, moving with a fluid, practiced grace to avoid tipping the boat. The etiquette continues, even in rest. You settle onto the floor, your head resting against the rough, salt-crusted mahogany. You are a navigator, a trader, and now, a small part of floating society of the 15th century Atlantic. The quiet struggle of the hierarchy is never-ending, but it is the glue that keeps the boat together. You close your eyes, the rhythmic scritch-scratch of the bailer's calabash acting as a strange, soothing lullaby. You are exactly where you are supposed to be, in the exact seat the master assigned you, drifting deeper into the heart of the blue. You have surrendered your name to the rhythm of the paddle, and for now, that is more than enough. The moon is a sliver of polished bone hanging in the velvet dark, and as you drift in the rhythmic swaying of the 15th century Atlantic, the rigid social hierarchy of the crew begins to fade into a different kind of order. You aren't just navigating a physical ocean anymore. You are moving through a spiritual landscape that is just as deep and far more temperamental than the salt water beneath your mahogany hull. The silence of the night is heavy, broken only by the low, guttural breathing of the swells, and you realize that the quiet struggle has shifted from the strength of your arms to the state of your soul. Out here, 100 miles from the nearest mangrove swamp, the line between the living world and the world of the spirits, the orishas and the ancient water deities, is as thin as a single layer of redwood. You're essentially in a floating chapel now, and if you haven't been keeping up with your spiritual rent, the abyss might just come to collect. You reach into a small, secret compartment near your seat and pull out a modest ceramic flask. It's filled with palm wine, sharp, fermented, and carrying a scent that cuts through the salty dampness of the night air like a knife. This isn't for you to drink, though the temptation to take a swig to calm your nerves is definitely there. You watch the master oarsman at the stern. He has already laid down his steering sweep and is staring into the black water with an intensity that makes the hair on your arms stand on end. He gives a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. You carefully uncork the flask and pour a thin, amber stream of the wine into the white foam of a passing wave. This is a libation, a quiet conversation with the great Mami Wata, the mother of the waters. You aren't just dumping liquid. You are paying the toll for crossing her abyss. Here is your mainstream history fact for the Spiritual Watch. The deities and spiritual practices of West African maritime cultures, particularly those involving Mami Wata and Alakan, the god of the deep ocean, were so resilient that they survived the brutal Middle Passage and became fundamental parts of the culture in the Americas. Voodoo in Haiti, Santeria in Cuba, and Candomblé in Brazil all share roots in the very rituals you are performing tonight in your pirogue. You aren't just practicing a local tradition. You are part of a spiritual engine that will eventually reshape the religious landscape of half the planet. It's a bit mind-blowing to think that your small ceramic flask is a precursor to a global cultural revolution, but in 1450, you're mostly just worried about not getting flipped over by a disgruntled water spirit. As the palm wine vanishes into the brine, you feel a strange vibration in the wood beneath your feet. It might just be a school of fish or a deep-sea current, but to you, it feels like an acknowledgement. This leads us to an obscure, slightly bizarre fact of the night: the spirit mirror taboo. Many West African mariners believe that the surface of the ocean at night was a literal mirror into the world of the ancestors. To look too directly at your own reflection in the moonlit water was to risk having your soul pulled into the deep, replaced by a spirit looking for a way out. Because of this, you always look at the stars or the horizon, never straight down. If you accidentally catch a glimpse of your face in a wave, you have to immediately rub salt on your forehead to blind the mirror. It sounds like a lot of work just to avoid looking at yourself, but in a world where the abyss is listening, you don't take chances. Now, as you sit in the darkness, the boat feeling like a tiny, fragile cradle in the arms of a giant, we reach that point of academic friction that keeps mythologists and historians debating in their candlelit studies: the Mami Wata origin debate. Mainstream history often suggests that the image of Mami Wata as a mermaid-like figure was heavily influenced by European sailors and their ship figureheads in the 15th and 16th centuries. However, a significant group of scholars and indigenous historians argue that the Mother of Water is a purely African archetype that predates any European contact. They point to ancient carvings and oral genealogies that describe powerful water spirits with long hair and serpent-like qualities long before the first Portuguese caravel appeared. Was Mami Wata a cultural fusion, or was she a primordial African truth that the Europeans simply tried to rename? The debate is as vast as the sea itself, but as you feel the protective presence of the ritual, the origins matter less than the reality of the connection. The struggle here is the quiet, internal battle against fear. The Atlantic isn't just a body of water, it's a presence. It's a fickle, powerful entity that can give you a bounty of gold and salt one day and swallow you whole the next. You feel the weight of the gold dust in the hull, and you wonder if Mami Wata finds it as valuable as the humans do. Probably not. To her, it's just shiny sand. You close your eyes and listen. You hear a sound like a distant, ethereal singing. Is it the wind through the palm mat sails? Or is it something else? You don't ask. In the 15th century, some things are better left as mysteries. You realize that your quiet struggle is part of a larger, cosmic balance. You are a guest in a house you didn't build, and the rules of the host are non-negotiable. Some crews even tied small pieces of white cloth to the bow of the canoe. This is another obscure detail. The color white, the color of the spirit world, was believed to act as a passport, signaling to the entities below that you were a traveler, not an intruder. You look at the small strip of cotton fluttering on your bow. It's frayed and salt-stained, but it's your diplomatic immunity in the abyss. It makes you feel a little less like an intruder and a little more like a pilgrim. You rub a small charm hanging around your neck, a gree-gree, containing sacred herbs and a tiny piece of mahogany from your very first boat. It's your grounding point in the fluid chaos of the night. The master oarsman begins to hum, a low, resonant sound that vibrates through the mahogany hull and into your very bones. It's a song of protection, a melody that hasn't changed in 500 years. You find your own voice joining him, a soft, whisper harmony that blends with the sound of the waves. The fear doesn't disappear, but it changes. It becomes respect. It becomes a part of the rhythm. You realize that to sail the 15th century Atlantic is to accept that you are always a passenger on a much larger journey. The quiet struggle of the soul is the most important navigation you'll ever do. The night air is getting colder, the humidity dropping as a land breeze begins to push against your back, carrying the faint, sweet scent of distant forest flowers. It's a sign that the spirits are satisfied. You settle back into your seat, the ceramic flask tucked safely away. The water is still dark, still deep, but it no longer feels like a threat. It feels like a path. You look up at the Southern Cross, its white fire guiding you through the darkness with a steady, silent promise. You are a navigator, a trader, and a believer in the mysteries of the 15th century Atlantic. The struggle of the soul is quiet, but tonight, the path is clear. You close your eyes, the masterism acting as a spiritual anchor, and let the ocean carry you toward the dawn. You are standing on the edge of the world again, but this time, the abyss has decided to send a representative to visit you. The sun is a pale, milky disk rising over the Atlantic, and as you pull your mahogany pirogue onto the damp sand of a remote beach near the Senegal River, you realize you aren't alone. A few hundred yards away, a massive, dark shape is resting in the surf, looking like a fallen island. It's a whale, a humpback that has lost its way and washed ashore. Now, in your modern life, you'd probably call animal rescue or start a live stream, but in 1450, this isn't just a tragedy or a biological event. It is a complex legal puzzle. The quiet struggle of the morning is no longer against the currents or the spirits, but against the intricate, invisible web of maritime law that governs every grain of sand on this coast. You move from a navigator's seat to a 15th century courtroom made of salt and driftwood. You don't just run toward the whale with a knife. That would be your first and last mistake. You stand back, resting your hand on the cool, salt-crusted gun of your boat, and wait for the beach master. This leads us to our mainstream history fact for this leg of the journey. Pre-colonial West African coastal societies, particularly in the Senegambia and Gold Coast regions, possess highly developed and rigid legal systems that specifically manage maritime resources. These weren't just vague customs or tribal suggestions. They were codified laws that determined who owned shipwrecked cargo, who had the right to salvage, and exactly how the bounty of the sea, like this whale, was to be distributed. Long before the international law of the sea was ever debated in European courts, you were living under a sophisticated maritime constitution that treated the shoreline as a high-stakes economic zone. The beach master arrives, a tall, imposing man carrying a staff decorated with cowrie shells and ocean-polished stones. He doesn't even look at the whale at first. He looks at the tide line. This is where we encounter an obscure, slightly bizarre fact of 15th century coastal law. The third wave rule in many maritime kingdoms. Anything that washed up on the shore belonged to the person who found it only if it remained on the sand after 3 consecutive high tides. If the ocean took it back before then, it was still considered property of the abyss, and trying to claim it was seen as a form of spiritual theft. You have to wait. You have to watch the water try to reclaim its gift. If the whale stays, it becomes a gift of God, but a gift with very specific small print regarding its division. As you watch the villagers begin the slow, rhythmic process of harvesting the whale under the beach master's watchful eye, the air fills with a heavy, oily scent that is both sweet and overwhelming. It's the smell of immense wealth. For a whale this size, the law dictates a surgical level of social division that would make a modern tax accountant dizzy. The tail usually belongs to the hunters who first spotted it. The head is reserved for the local king or layman, and the blubber, the most valuable part for oil and food, is divided among the widows and the elderly of the village. You are essentially watching a 15th century social safety net being carved out of a giant mammal. It's a quiet, organized struggle of bureaucracy in the middle of a wilderness. Now, as the sun gets higher, baking the scent of the whale into the sand, we reach that point of academic friction that keeps legal historians and anthropologists arguing over their dusty manuscripts. The common versus crown dispute. Mainstream history often suggests that all coastal resources in Africa were the absolute property of the monarchs, that the king owned the sea and everything in it. However, a significant group of scholars argues that many West African maritime laws were actually common heritage systems. They point to oral traditions where the right of the shore belonged to the community, and the king was merely a trustee who couldn't take anything without the village council's approval. The debate is whether your society was a top-down autocracy or sophisticated, community-managed maritime cooperative. Was your king a CEO or just a chairman of the board? Historians argue over the translation of ancient titles, but as you watch the village council debate the distribution of the whale meat, it feels like a very noisy, very democratic negotiation. The quiet struggle of this chapter is the patience required to navigate these rules without losing your cool. You have found a crate, a heavy wooden box that likely fell off one of those floating castles during a storm. You want to open it, obviously. You want to see if it's full of those wool blankets or iron pots we talked about, but you have to wait for the official witness. In the 15th century, if you open a salvage crate alone, you are a pirate. If you wait for the beach master, you are a legitimate salvager entitled to a finder's fee of exactly 1/3. You sit on the sand, leaning against your pirogue, watching the crabs scuttle around the mystery box. There's a strange, late-night humor in the situation. You are a master of the Atlantic abyss, a man who has danced with the Canary Current and survived a 10-minute death. Yet you are currently being defeated by a set of administrative rules about lost and found property. Eventually, the witness arrives. The crate is open with a heavy iron pry bar, and the sound of splintering wood echoes across the beach. Inside, there are no gold coins or jewels, which is a bit of a letdown, but there are dozens of heavy woolen blankets and a set of iron cooking pots. To you, in 1450, this is a jackpot. These are high-status trade items that will fetch a fortune in the inland markets. You feel a sense of relief as the beach master marks the crate with your salvage sign, a specific notch carved into the wood that proves it belongs to you. You have navigated the legal abyss and come out with your reputation and your profit intact. The sun is directly overhead now, and the beach is a hive of activity. The whale is being transformed into piles of meat and jars of oil, and your floating castle crate is being loaded into your pirogue. You feel a deep, heavy fatigue, but it's balanced by a sense of order. The sea is chaotic and lawless, yes, but the shore is organized and fair. You realize that the quiet struggle isn't just about surviving the waves. It's about surviving the people on the land. You need both the stars to guide you and the laws to protect you. You push your pirogue back into the water, the extra weight of the blankets making the mahogany sit a little deeper in the surf. You look back at the beach one last time. The skeleton of the whale is already starting to emerge in the sand, a white cage that will soon be a landmark for other navigators. You settle into familiar rhythm of the paddle, the abyss welcoming you back into its blue embrace. You are a navigator, a salvager, and a law-abiding citizen of the 15th century Atlantic. The struggle is quiet, the rules are old, and the tide is always right. You close your eyes for a second, feeling the warmth of the sun and the steady pull of the water, and you realize that even in 1450, a good lawyer or a good beach master is worth his weight in gold. The sun is no longer a golden coin. It is a heavy, bruised weight of crimson and violet sinking into the absolute edge of the Atlantic, turning the entire ocean into a sheet of liquid fire. You are paddling toward the last light of 1450, and the mahogany hull of your pirogue feels less like a boat and more like an extension of your own skin. You can feel the heartbeat of the waves through the wood, and for the first time in weeks, that heartbeat is syncing up with yours. The quiet struggle of this journey, the relentless currents, the poison arrows and the mangroves, the silent trades for gold and the long, spiritual watches under the stars, is beginning to settle into your bones as a profound, hollow ache. It's the kind of exhaustion that makes your soul feel heavy, but in a way that's strangely satisfying. You can see the shoreline now. It's not a thin yellow line anymore. It's a living, breathing presence. You can hear the rhythmic, low-frequency thrum of the surf hitting the sandbars, a sound that in this part of the world we call the breath of the land. You are coming home, but the ocean doesn't let go of its children without one final, liquid negotiation. You watch the waves carefully, squinting against the glare of the setting sun. This is, quite literally, the most dangerous moment of the entire trip. If you mess this up, all that gold dust and those fancy iron pots you salvage will end up as a permanent donation to the reef, and you'll be the guy who survived the abyss only to be defeated by his own backyard. This leads us to an obscure, slightly bizarre fact of 15th century maritime survival: the beach kiss technique. Landing a heavy, gold-laden pirogue through the African surf isn't about speed or raw power. It's about a very specific, high-stakes kind of stalling. You and your crew wait for the seventh wave, the mother wave. In your maritime lore, the seventh wave is believed to carry the most strength and the smoothest path. Just as it begins to break, you don't paddle forward. You and your crew back paddle with everything you have left. You want the boat to stall on the very crest of the foam, so that it slides onto the sand like a sledge rather than a vessel. If you get the timing wrong by even half a second, the Atlantic will flip your mahogany cradle and bury your pride in 6 feet of churning sand. It's a 15th century version of a precision landing, and your heart is pounding harder than it did during the river ambush. Here is your mainstream history fact to anchor your thoughts as you navigate the surf. By the late 15th century, the maritime networks you've been navigating were so essential and sovereign that when the Portuguese finally established the famous fortress of São Jorge de Elmina in 1482, they didn't do it as conquerors. They actually had to negotiate a lease and pay regular rent to the local African king, Kwame Ansa. The Europeans weren't in charge. They were tenants on your beach. The Gold Coast was a global economic powerhouse, and the mariners, men exactly like you who knew every sandbar, every star, and every mood of the mother wave, were the engineers of that power. You weren't just a witness to history. You were the person making it possible for the world to connect. You were the software that made the global trade hardware actually work. You feel the surge of the mother wave beneath the hull. It lifts you, tilting the world so that for a moment, you're looking down at the beach from a height of 10 feet. It's a terrifying, exhilarating perspective. You give the signal, and you dig your paddle in one last time, your muscles screaming in a final, glorious protest. The hull hits the wet sand with a deep, satisfying thud. It's a sound of finality, the sound of the abyss giving you back to the earth. You jump out into the waist-deep water, the cold brine shocking your tired legs back to life. You and the crew grab the gunnels, pulling the heavy mahogany higher onto the sand as the wave recedes with a long, reluctant hiss. You are back. Your feet are sinking into the solid, unmoving certainty of the land, and it feels like the greatest luxury in the world. Now, as you stand there, dazed and salt-crusted, watching the villagers run toward you, we reach the final point of academic friction that keeps historians in a state of high-drama debate, the Great Erasure controversy. For centuries, mainstream Western history almost completely ignored the maritime achievements of West Africa, portraying the Atlantic as a European lake until the 15th century. However, modern historians are now engaged in a massive, urgent effort to reclaim this narrative. They argue that the erasure wasn't just an accident, but a deliberate byproduct of the colonial era designed to justify the slave trade by portraying Africans as landbound and primitive. The debate today is how we reconstruct a maritime history that was primarily oral and lived, rather than written in dusty European ledgers. Did the world lose the history of the African Atlantic, or are we just finally learning how to listen to the oral traditions and look at the archaeological silt? The debate is the ultimate struggle of memory against silence, and your journey tonight is a small part of that reclamation. You perform one last obscure ritual before the crowds reach you. You reach down, pick up a handful of dry, fine sand and touch it to your forehead. This is the end of the abyss greeting. You are thanking the land for being solid, for being still, and for welcoming the salt-crusted stranger back into its arms. You look at your boat. It looks different on the sand. Heavier, darker, almost like a sleeping whale resting after a long migration. You realize that you aren't the same person who pushed off into the surf all those weeks ago. The Atlantic has changed you. It has given you the abyss stare. That certain look in your eyes that only other mariners recognize, a look that says you've seen the stars from the middle of the void and survived. The village is a hive of activity now. The torches are being lit, flickering like orange stars against the darkening forest. You begin to unload the cargo. The iron pots clink against each other with metallic cheer. The woolen blankets feel strangely soft and heavy in your hands, and the gold dust remains a secret, heavy weight in its ceramic jars. Your kin are coming to hear the stories. The stories of the floating castles, the 10-minute death in the mangroves, and the taste of the sweet water at the river's mouth. You will tell them everything, but for right now, you just want to stand still. You want to feel the earth not moving beneath you. You realize that the quiet struggle isn't just about surviving the waves. It's about the quiet pride of knowing you can cross the abyss and find your way back to the fire. The struggle is over. The quiet struggle of the 15th century Atlantic mariner has come to its natural, peaceful conclusion. You have navigated the currents of the sea and the currents of history, and you have held your ground. You feel a deep, heavy sense of accomplishment that settles into your chest like a warm stone. You look back at the ocean one last time. It's just a dark, breathing void now, the stars reflecting the wet sand at your feet. It's no longer a threat. It's a memory. You turn your back on the Atlantic and start walking toward the village, toward the smell of roasting yams and the sound of laughter. You are a navigator, a trader, and a survivor. You have crossed the abyss, and you have returned with the light. Now, let the weight of the journey finally leave your limbs. Your muscles, which have been coiled like springs for so long, are finally beginning to uncurl. The sound of the waves is fading, becoming a distant, fuzzy hum, like a soft blanket being pulled over your ears. The mahogany hull, the salt spray, the gold dust, and the white-winged caravels, they are all drifting away now, dissolving into the soft, velvet shadows of your room. You are no longer a mariner in 1450. You are just a dreamer, floating in the gentle, steady current of your own breath. The stars we follow tonight, Canopus and the Southern Cross, are the same stars watching over you right now, steady and silent in the vastness above. They've seen every journey, and they've seen every return. Feel the stillness of your bed beneath you, just like the stillness of the sand after the long voyage. The abyss is at peace. The shore has been reached, and the story has finally found its home in the quiet of the night. You don't have to paddle anymore. You don't have to watch the horizon. You just have to let go. The air around you is cool and calm, a gentle land breeze carrying you deeper into the darkness of sleep. You are safe. You are warm. You are exactly where you need to be. The history of the world is a long, winding river, and for tonight, your part in it is done. Let the shadows embrace you. Let the rhythm of the tides become the rhythm of your dreams. Sleep now, mariner. The land has you back, and the stars will keep the watch until the sun rises again.